Welcome to the second hour of KCDC. With me on set, co-founder of Foundry Strategies and MSNBC political analyst Rick Tyler, Washington bureau chief for Vice News Shawna Thomas, and from Nashville, presidential historian and MSNBC contributor Jon Meacham. He is, of course, the author of the book The Soul of America: The Battle for Our Better Angels. And Jon, we're going to start with you because the president tweeted today, quote, "Study the late Joseph McCarthy because we are now in period with Mueller and his gang that make Joseph McCarthy look like a baby. Rigged witch hunt." Could you please give us all a history lesson about Joseph McCarthy and how this is relevant or not?
Yeah, this is a case where I think he's suggesting the wrong course. The more you look at Joe McCarthy, the more you realize that Joe McCarthy has become president, not that Joe McCarthy is working in the special counsel's office. Joe McCarthy was a junior senator from Wisconsin. On Lincoln's birthday in 1950, he gave a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, where he said he had in his hand the names of 205 communists. The number wandered down in the State Department. The number wandered down to 57, and ultimately he didn't find any. He came to anti-communism late. There were communist agents in the government, but they've been largely taken care of by the Truman administration. The lesson for us here is that Joe McCarthy was, and see if any of this sounds familiar, a freelance political performer, entranced and intoxicated by headlines, by his own name in print, by his own voice on the radio, ultimately his own face on television. And he was a figure of a new modern media age that was unfolding in the early 1950s and was ultimately undone, according to his own Rudy Giuliani, a man named Roy Cohn, who, by the way, was Donald Trump's lawyer when Trump was in New York. So sometimes God just gives you these parallels. Was undone because he exaggerated too much, he overstated, he didn't deliver on what he had promised. And the idea that Donald Trump would be offering the charge of McCarthyism toward anyone else, the word irony no longer has any application in our era, but it blows it up beyond recognition at this point.
And it all, of course, is cyclical. Let's get to some brand new reporting from the New York Times and yet another concerning headline for this president. This one reads, quote, "Trump's lawyers' sudden realization. They don't know what Don McGahn told Mueller's team." The paper reported yesterday that McGahn has been cooperating extensively with the special counsel's Russia inquiry, and now reports that Mr. McGahn's lawyer has only provided a limited accounting of what Mr. McGahn said during some 30 hours of questioning. Times writes, quote, "The president, who's said to be obsessed with the role that John Dean, the White House counsel to Richard Nixon, played as an informant during Watergate, was jolted by the notion that he did not know what Mr. McGahn had shared." Meanwhile, McGahn reportedly told others he was determined to avoid the same fate as Dean. As for Dean himself, he tweeted this weekend that McGahn is doing right. Oh, and Politico reported tonight that Michael Cohen's lawyer, Lanny Davis, has been reaching out to Dean regularly over the past few months. And I'm sorry to keep our panelists waiting, but Jon Meacham, since we're sticking in history here with John Dean, fascinating that both the president of the United States as well as his lawyer are thinking about John Dean in this particular moment, because Dean himself did what he did, and please help fill in the gaps for some of our viewers who may have forgotten these bits of their American history classes, but essentially he was afraid he was going to be the scapegoat.
Absolutely. Dean was a very young, I think he was 32, 33 years old when he was in the Nixon White House. He was brought in as White House counsel. He was in and out of a number of meetings in the very hard-hitting Nixon White House. He was the first real break in the administration as Watergate began to unfold. The Watergate break-in, remember, was June 17th, 1972. The Watergate hearings didn't start, I think, until May of 73, and then the drama took another 14 months or so until Nixon resigned. Dean was that figure as the hearings were taking off. who was incredibly adept at framing the issue. As he famously said, I believe that there's a cancer growing on the presidency, by which he meant the Nixon cover-up, which was ultimately proven out by the tapes, where Nixon was saying we should use one agency to block another agency to keep the investigation from unfolding. One of the things I think is so interesting about the invocation of John Dean at this point is, remember, Trump's frame of history is not what I would call wide. But because of his long time, I'm trying to be, it's Sunday, so we're being nice. But because of Roger Stone, and Stone, of course, was a great Nixonite and a longtime Trump advisor, the Nixon example is very real to President Trump. And Dean is in the world, the iconography of Nixon and Watergate. Dean is the rat, as Nixon, as Trump. There's Freud for you, as Trump said this weekend. So there is this obsession. I think that, and I would think this. So take it for what it's worth. I think the fact that the president has both invoked Joe McCarthy and Watergate in a very short period of time does suggest that he feels the walls closing in. Those are the two of the most portentous, two of the most divisive, and ultimately devastating stories for their principles. Joe McCarthy was censured by the Senate and died an alcoholic death, really, in 1957. And, of course, President Nixon had to leave Washington in disgrace. I think there's something telling about the fact that these are the examples that the president's going back to.
Yeah. Shauna Thomas, what's your take on that?
I mean, I think that perhaps the president is starting to learn the right lesson about what the White House counsel's job is by invoking John Dean. And here's the thing, is that it seems he confuses a lot of things. Like, he calls it a witch hunt, but is he talking about himself and collusion, or is he talking about the overall idea of, like, what Mueller is investigating? The White House counsel is not his personal lawyer.
Right.
And I think that is starting to become very clear to the president, and maybe his personal lawyers, like Rudy Giuliani, are finally telling him that, is that it is not Don McGahn's job to protect the president it's not Don McGahn's job to protect President Trump. It's Don McGahn's job to protect the presidency, right? And if that also combines with Don McGahn trying to protect himself from having to go to jail, which I believe John Dean had to do in that situation, then I think Don McGahn's going to work for himself and work for the White House and maybe work for the American people. But he does not work for President Trump.
Yeah. The Times did report this winter that the president has been frustrated with his legal team. McGahn was asked in March of 2017 with preventing Attorney General Jeff Sessions from recusing himself from the Russia investigation. Quote, Mr. McGahn was unsuccessful, and the president erupted in anger in front of numerous White House officials, saying he needed his attorney general to protect him. Mr. Trump said he had expected his top law enforcement official to safeguard him the way he believed Robert Kennedy, as attorney general, had done for his brother, and Eric Holder had for Barack Obama. Mr. Trump then asked, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" Cohn, of course, was the hard-charging, much-reviled lawyer and mentor to Trump who prosecuted Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and made his name assisting the aforementioned Senator Joe McCarthy, and later fought back wave after wave of federal charges, tooth and nail.
I'm outlining 15 specific, documentable instances where Morgenthau's office, as I say, has called down young ladies I go with and interrogated them, frightened lawyers out of the office, gotten a hold of every bank with which I deal and my firm deals.
Well, this latest bi-monthly indictment of Mr. Morgenthau's is deceitful, dishonest, and a cheap grandstand play. He tries his cases with the smear headlines, and he loses them when they get to court. This thing is made up out of whole cloth, and it's just a continuation of Mr. Morgenthau's vendetta against me.
I wonder if Rudy Giuliani has been studying those tapes. Rick Tyler, this is a president who, to a certain extent, seems to be increasingly on an island. His original legal team is no longer working for him. The lawyers inside the White House, Don McGahn, has cooperated with Mueller's team. Jeff Sessions, obviously still recused. To a certain extent, it's clear that it seems as though the walls are closing in, as Shauna notes. But so what's next here?
Well, if you don't have a subscription to the New York Times, you really should get one, for this story is really amazing because it really walks through. And you have to remember, it was Dowd who had this this strategy that we're going to be transparent, right? And that kind of led over and into where McGahn was, and then McGahn was told to fire Jeff Sessions. He attempted to do that, but I think in that process he realized that he was putting himself at risk. Right. What's shocking here is it took this long for us to see, and I don't know, the White House and apparently the president, to know that Don McGahn was cooperating. He knew he was cooperating. To what extent he was cooperating, but to the extent that Don McGahn is actually trying to, one, as Shauna said, he understands that he represents a presidency or a defense presidency, not Donald Trump personally. But second, that he could be caught up on all this, and that it looked as if he was protecting himself from Donald Trump actually setting him up to be the fall guy. In other words, when when the proverbial hit the fan, he was going to be able to say, but I got all this terrible legal advice from Don McGahn. Don McGahn has now inoculated himself from that.
Well, and that's essentially where the John Dean comparison comes from, because Dean, part of what spurred his cooperation was his own fear that he was going to be scapegoated by Nixon and the rest of the team around him. Don McGahn is an interesting figure to me in this, Sean. I mean, I remember I stood and watched a lot of Trump's announcements standing next to him in the lobby of Trump Tower talking about, I mean, I was surprised to see him because he was somebody who has been around Washington for a long time, worked on the Federal Election Commission. You know, you bump into him at Cap Lounge or, you know, wherever we used to go when we were in our 20s. You know, but there he was at the announcement, and sometimes people forget that he was kind of involved in the campaign at its earliest stages and incarnations, and has really been, you know, kind of sometimes not necessarily the central player, but oftentimes in the room.
Yeah, and people are, and that's one of the issues with the Comey situation, was how much does Don McGahn know about what President Trump told Comey and that kind of thing. But I also think, as he's someone who's been around D.C., but also was working for President Trump when he was candidate Trump to a certain extent, he probably also kind of had to grow into that job too, the job of White House counsel. He had to figure out what it entailed, and probably the idea of being the guy behind trying to convince Jeff Sessions not to recuse himself was probably a lesson for him, because I mean that speaks to what I was saying before. Jeff Sessions doesn't work for the President of the United States. Jeff Sessions works for the American people in the Department of Justice. Don McGahn was probably learning on the job, and perhaps he has also read John Dean's book and has now figured out how he should be handling this. I don't think that means Don McGahn is not doing his job well as White House counsel, but I do think it means he needs to figure out how this affects him personally.
Yeah, I think that's been a consideration as well that's weighed very heavily on a lot of people who've departed the White House as well.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.